A very good evening to you all, and welcome to this evening's event. My name is Dr. Nyasha Gondora, and I have the privilege of being the leader of the Waterloo chapter of the CSCA, which is the Canadian Scientific and Christian Affiliation. So I see here that many of you are joining us for the first time. So I'll take a moment to tell you a bit about the CSCA and what it's all about. So the CSCA was founded in 1973 and currently has approximately 11 active chapters spread across the territories and provinces of Canada. We have a fairly broad membership. Most of our members are researchers, either in academia or industry, professors, philosophers, theologians, and students, and really anyone in the community who is interested in learning about faith and science and engaging in dialogue on this multidisciplinary platform. And personally, what I love most about the CSCA is just the people who make up this community. It's always a pleasure to connect, like we're doing tonight, and have the chance to learn new things. So thank you all for being here this evening, and I'm sure you're ready for an interesting evening where we get to learn a lot from our speakers. So that being said, the title of our talk today is Addressing the Elephant in the Room: Can Faith and Science Coexist? And today we have the great privilege of learning from two individuals who are part of the Waterloo CSCA, Dr. Robert Mann and Pastor Nancy Mann. I'm really excited to introduce them. So I shall start by reading their biographies. All right. Pastor Nancy Mann has a bachelor's and a master's in economics from McMaster University, and she also has a master's in Adult Education and Counselling from the University of Toronto and a master's in Theological and Ministerial Studies from the University of Waterloo, Conrad Grebel College. Nancy has worked in pastoral ministry for many years. She has served as the associate pastor at Floradale Mennonite Church. She has also served as a pastor at Waterloo-Kitchener United Mennonite Church and as a pastoral care coordinator at Nithview Community. Earlier in her career, Nancy worked as a counsellor at the University of Waterloo, where she worked for 16 years. Nancy is currently retired. Welcome, Nancy. I shall now read Dr. Mann's biography. So Dr. Mann has a bachelor's in physics from McMaster University and a master's and PhD from the University of Toronto. And he was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University. Currently a professor of physics at the University of Waterloo, he has been a visiting professor at Harvard and Cambridge universities. At Waterloo, he works on gravitation, quantum physics, and the overlap of these two subjects. He is interested in questions that provide us with information about the foundation of physics, particularly those that could be tested by experiment. And author of over 450 papers, he has received several awards, including the 2019 Canadian Association of Physics, CAP, Medal for Excellence in Teaching Undergraduate Physics, a Fulbright Fellowship, Teaching Excellence Awards from the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance, and from the University of Waterloo. He's also received an Outstanding Referee Award from the American Physics Society. He was the chair of the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of Waterloo from 2001 to 2008, and is an affiliate member of the Perimeter Institute and the Institute for Quantum Computing. Additionally, he was the president of the CAP from 2009 to 2011, and of this organization, the CSCA, from 1996 to 2005. And he has served on the advisory board of the John Templeton Foundation. His research interests are in black holes, cosmology, particle physics, quantum foundations, quantum information, and the science and religion dialogue. We are very privileged this evening to get to hear from two individuals who have been great leaders in their respective fields. Welcome, Robert and Nancy. Before we begin the interview—
Thank you, Nyasha. Very kind introduction.
We're so honored to have you with us this evening, and just really looking forward to gaining some insight from your personal experiences. Before we begin, I would like to let everyone who's attending know that we will have a Q&A segment after the interview, so please post any questions that you may have in the Q&A box that you may see at the bottom of your screen. So now as we begin, Nancy and Robert, anyone who has had the chance to know you or work with you can honestly attest to just how phenomenal you are as a couple. But to those in our midst today who have not had the chance to meet you, can you tell us, who are you as a couple?
Well, hopefully everybody can see that. Maybe it's a little bit like this. Can science and faith coexist? Why don't you begin, Nancy?
Sure. So Rob and I actually met each other in our high school years at a Christian outreach group called Young Life. At the time, I was attending a United Church, Binkley United Church in Hamilton, where my family was worshiping over many years.
And I was attending an Anglican church. This is Binkley Church Nancy was at. I was attending this Anglican church, St. Paul's Anglican in Hamilton. Neither of these churches had an active youth ministry, which is partly why we got involved with Young Life. We dated during our university years. Both of us were undergraduates at McMaster, shown in the picture here. And we got married in 1978 at Binkley United Church, and there we are at our wedding with the people in attendance. And this was near the end of our undergrad degrees. I had just finished fourth year of university. Nancy had just finished third year.
Of course, that seems very young by today's standards, but it was not uncommon at the time.
We have been married for 42 and a half years, and we have a young adult daughter who lives with her husband in British Columbia.
During our adult years, we gave leadership during our young adult years, we gave leadership to a youth group at Binkley United Church for many years.
And throughout our marriage, we've been active in Christian ministry, primarily in Christian education. This is First Mennonite Church in Kitchener, where we worshiped for many years, and we were quite active, as I said, in Christian education there.
So I have been the wife of a scientist for over 40 years.
And I have been a pastor's husband for 15 of those years. We'll say more about why it was only 15 later on. We have some common interests. You can see one in the picture here where we're on a hike on Manitoulin Island. We like hiking, we like nature, we like cycling. We like the arts, going to the theater, going to the movies, singing. We both are in several choirs, or rather we were until the pandemic hit. We like to travel, and in the winter we do cross-country ski.
We also have some disparate interests. So Rob's fond of pets, and I've capitulated twice, but not at the current time. I enjoy cooking, and Rob not so much. I enjoy playing racket sports, so I have to find partners to play with. Rob enjoys science fiction, and he watches a lot of it on his own.
So that's a little bit about us as a couple.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing, Nancy and Rob. It's lovely to hear more about you as individuals, your interests, and really what brings you together as a couple. It was really lovely to see, the history from when you first met, what you've been involved in over the years, and where you are today. Thank you so much for sharing. And now with that, we'd like to switch gears a little bit and hear about your motivations to pursue your given careers. So Rob, I'll start with you. What made you decide to become a scientist?
Well, I put up a brief history of myself here. I was born in Montreal, but at a young age, my father had a job transfer. So I grew up in the Southern Ontario region, and we've been in Waterloo since 1987. I did grow up in a Christian home. We did go to church. We went to a number of different denominations, United, Presbyterian, Anglican for most of my growing up years. I was confirmed in the Anglican church. After we got married, we went, when I was at Harvard, we went to an independent evangelical church, Baptist, and then most recently, since we moved to Waterloo, Mennonite. You already introduced me as having my bachelor's from McMaster and my master's and doctorate from the University of Toronto, all in physics, all in theoretical physics, as it turned out. I did postdoc work at Harvard. In 1984, I became an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, and in 1987, I became an associate, and then a few years later, a full professor at the University of Waterloo. And this is one of the things I do like very much doing. It's a picture of me teaching a fourth-year class, and that is one of the few demonstrations I'm able to do. It's a demonstration of a mathematical object called a spinner. I don't have time to explain how the demo works right now, but trust me, that is the demo. Why did I go into physics? Originally, I liked math more, but I thought as an early undergrad, physics would be better employment-wise, which actually isn't the case. Math is a more employable degree. But I discovered as I went through the physics program and took a lot of math courses, what I discovered I liked about mathematics was really what we do in physics. It's namely solving equations and understanding what they mean. And as I like to tell my undergrad students, the hard thing about physics is not solving the equations, it's knowing which equations to solve. And that understanding of what the relevant equations for nature are speaks, I think, at a deep philosophical level as to what the basic structure of the universe is. And as I went on in the subject, I think I came to understand physics is a theological calling of sorts. One of the ministers, John Morris of the church we went to, Binkley, said, this is like thinking God's thoughts after him. And I really have come to understand and believe the quest for scientific knowledge is part of a quest to understand God, our creator, the one who knows us. It's not the only way, but it is a way, I think.
Fantastic. Thanks for sharing, Robert. So what I'm hearing here is that you pursued physics, but in that process, really the science-religion dialogue is something that naturally emerged and became of interest to you.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Now over to you, Nancy. I'd like to hear why you decided to become a pastor.
Sure. Well, first of all, I will apologize that photo seems a bit out of focus. Perhaps that's because I've always been a bit out of focus. For as long as I can remember, I've been interested in questions about personal well-being and spirituality. I was raised in a Christian family, and regular attendance at church and church activities was a significant part of my childhood and youth experience. Therefore, this is the context in which I explored my spiritual questions. I remember visiting a career counselor at university who helped me understand that I had much in common with people who pursued careers in both counseling and in ministry. However, looking back, I realized that to enter ministry as a vocational calling in my 20s was something that would probably have required a certain amount of ego strength that I did not possess as a young adult. Therefore, in my first career, I pursued my qualifications in counseling. And I was extremely fortunate by the age of 30 to obtain a position as a counselor for students at the University of Waterloo. Many two-career couples have difficulty finding work in the same region, never mind the same institution. So I felt very grateful for that. And I held this position for 16 years. I found it very interesting, challenging, and rewarding work. So why then, in my mid-40s, did I decide to leave this position and enter pastoral ministry? Well, there are many factors, but I will mention just a few. I think it is important to feel God's call to ministry. For me, this partly took the form of an emerging sense that I could embrace a role of leadership in the church. something that I felt ill-equipped to do in my younger years. Partly, it was a stage in life when the demands of my home life felt less onerous. For one reason that I wanted to serve in pastoral ministry was due to something I noticed amongst the students that I was counseling. I noticed how many students felt lonely and isolated in their university experience. I realized that a connection to a church offered people a level of spiritual and social support that it could improve their personal well-being on a variety of levels. I also decided that I wanted to be able to have more open conversations with people about spiritual matters, about how they experienced God's support in times of trouble, and how they felt God's love for them and sought God's guidance in their lives. And I was very fortunate to have 3 opportunities to serve in pastoral ministry before my retirement in 2018.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing, Nancy. It's just lovely to see how your career has progressed. You mentioned earlier having that initial passion and that love for ministry, but as the seasons of life unfolded, a good time came where you felt ready, prepared, and equipped to walk in that calling. So it's really great to hear about that and your journey. Thank you for sharing, both of you. So now to the main question. Many people think that faith and science cannot coexist. What are your thoughts on this topic, and how have you come to this conclusion?
Well, as I said in the abstract, I think the short answer is yes, they can. And I think it's because science, in some sense, is intrinsic to Christian faith, to Christianity, because Christianity is concerned with God's action in the real world as creator of the world, of the universe, as sustainer, being immanent in the universe and appearing incarnate in the person of Christ, and as the keeper of the ultimate destiny of the universe in general and of our lives in particular. I can speak to a little bit to some of the historic issues. Let me share the screen again. So we're all familiar with the conflict. I expect we're all familiar with the conflict Galileo had with the Catholic Church in the first part of the 1600s. And this unfortunately set things on a bit of an awkward course between faith and science, a conflict between what constituted authority and where it resided. But it didn't end there. Christianity had a much more, science faith had a much more positive reception in England, where the Protestant ethic was good fertile ground for the subject. It was a way of bettering humanity, the understanding that scientific knowledge could be applied to basically improve society, improve the lives of people. Here's a drawing of Newton symbolizing his work in optics, and in mathematics. You see the Principia down at the lower left. In terms of gravitation and the motion of the planets, symbolized by the telescope and the planets here at the upper left. And there were many other scientists of faith throughout the decades that made very significant contributions to the subject. When Charles Darwin came along, a new rift appeared because there was now a way, according to his work, of scientifically understanding life, its origins, and its interconnectivity. And these debates about creation and evolution continue. And in some sense, this ushered in a scientific era that is perhaps more characterized by agnosticism or atheism. Here's a picture of Marie Curie that I think was, to my knowledge, quite agnostic about the subject. And there has been in the last, throughout the 20th century, and I would say very much in my lifetime, a lively debate and discussion and a realization that the subject is actually quite nuanced and is not a simple matter of understanding which one wins, which one loses, though it's very easy to find cartoons on the internet that personify that. I happen to personally know a famous scientist of faith. That's a picture of a famous scientist. I'm not talking about the guy in the middle. I'm talking about the woman on the right. This is a reception for Donna Strickland, who won the Nobel Prize 2 years ago. So faith and science, I think, do have common features, and I listed a few of what I think are the main ones. Intelligibility ranks very high. What we have learned from science is the universe is a deeply mathematically intelligible place. The deeper we search, the more we understand that there is a very subtle, beautiful mathematics that describes how it works. And in my view, this very much speaks to a mind that undergirds reality. I just don't know how to make sense of it otherwise. Intelligibility points to an intelligence. It's also a place of great beauty. It didn't have to be. We find the universe not only intelligible, but beautiful. This is appreciable by scientists and non-scientists alike. It's a place of directedness. No person lives their life as though it were purposeless. We all seek some notion of purpose and meaning, and the universe itself has a developmental history that shows it's not an endless repetition of something or an eternal regurgitation. It's going somewhere. That's a lesson we've learned from cosmology. It also has a level of particularity that as we study nature, we realize while it is a particular way, as the laws of physics tell us, it could have been something else. We've learned that the laws of physics could have been different, and that these differences are intimately connected with the possibility that life can exist. This is known sometimes as the anthropic principle, and I don't have time to go into it, but the short story is that were we to change by just a tiny bit one of the fundamental constants of nature, like the mass of the proton or the strength of electromagnetism, life as we know it could not exist. That's a very curious fact that did not have to be true. I personally think it has some deeper theological meaning. The universe is something that also invokes a great sense of awe and wonder. And this is where I found the most common ground between believer and unbeliever, between the believing scientist and the atheistic one. And as I said a short while ago, science is not simply an abstract exercise, though much of what I do is in that category. It's an applied discipline in medicine, in pharmacology, in environmental studies, and so on. And how we apply science necessarily goes beyond science and requires, I think, a kind of moral framework and infrastructure that ultimately needs a theological underpinning. But there are distinctions, as I've got on the right. Humility versus mastery is one of them. When you do science and you see that equations really do describe things, or when you do an experiment and discover it works, or when you're an engineer and make something, man, do you feel powerful. But faith calls us to be humble before God, to remember that we are not the center of the universe, either individually or collectively. There is a bit of a tension there, I think. Connected with that, perhaps, are issues of verification versus trust. Faith calls us to trust in God, to give our lives to Christ, to surrender, yield to the Holy Spirit. Whereas science, the attitude of the scientist is, and rightly so, well, you think this is true, but what evidence is there that this is the case? What are your rational arguments and your observations that indicate I should believe what you're saying? And I think that's a very necessary part of thinking. And while I don't think the two are in contradiction, they are in tension. And at a deepest level, I think it goes to the perspectives they call us to view the universe. This comes from theologian Martin Buber. Science demands objectification of the object of study. It. I am the scientist. This thing I am studying, the new drug, the rock, the animal, isn't it. It is apart from me, and I am the investigator. Whereas faith calls us to an I-thou relationship. First with God, the great other, our creator, that wishes relationship with us, that we relate me and you, I and thou, and by extension, other people created in the image of God, that they are not objects to be measured and studied. They are people with whom we have relationship. They're neither are finished exercises. Science is an unfinished endeavor that at its core contains deep apparent contradictions or incompleteness. We might say a bit more about that later. Faith is an ongoing relationship with the Creator that wishes to make us whole and find with us our purpose in the universe. So yeah, there are conflicts and paradoxes. I guess I like to think they're apparent within each, within faith, within science, and between them. But I think this is not a bad thing, because when you wrestle with a paradox, you learn something, you gain a deeper understanding.
I think the question is not whether science and faith can coexist. We already know that they do coexist. Science is a way of learning about things that can be objectively observed and measured. But there are many things in the human experience that we cannot know objectively. How do we measure the quality of our interpersonal relationships? How do we measure things like love, hate, fear, pain? No one would deny that these things are part of our human experience, but we have a very limited ability to measure them objectively. Science asks, what can we know about the world in which we live? How does the human body function? How can we cure diseases? How can we preserve the natural environment? But from the perspective of faith, people ask different questions. They ask, what is the moral or ethical basis from which I want to live my life? What is the purpose of my life? How can I find joy in my life? How can I find love? What are my obligations and responsibilities to others? These are fundamentally spiritual questions, and they are very compelling to people, whatever spiritual traditions they follow. Christians might also ask, how can I live a life that is pleasing to God? Too often, the dichotomy between science and faith, particularly in the Christian tradition, focuses on questions about the origins of the earth and the development of the human species. I would like to suggest that there are other ways in which scientific discovery relates to our thinking about spiritual and ethical issues. I'm going to touch briefly on three things, and I'm sure you can think of many others. Firstly, it is a spiritual or ethical imperative of our time to consider how we will respond to indicators of climate change and preserve our climate for future generations. Preserve our planet for future generations, and our climate too, I guess. But it is science which gives us the measurements that inform us that climate change is happening. And it will be science which will bring us the discoveries that will allow us to transition from pollution-creating forms of energy to greener alternatives. Second, it is a Christian ethic that all people should have sufficient food to meet their daily needs. Jesus commands us to feed the hungry. In today's farming culture in North America, farmers use diverse and complex technologies to monitor the production of their crops and increase their productivity. Of course, you just have to drive out into the countryside at harvest time to see many of these large machines in operation. And farmers use webcams and iPads and computers and all kinds of modern technologies to monitor their agricultural activities here in North America. But technologies which address specific issues in developing countries are also being invented. A mobile app called eLocus 3 seemed to be a good example to share. It is used to monitor and quickly detect one of the most dangerous migratory pest species in the world, the desert locust. The app combines the latest technologies into a unified monitoring and early warning system. It has contributed significantly to a decline in the duration, severity, and frequency of devastating desert locust plagues in Africa and Asia. And of course, there would be many other examples of how technology is being used to enhance and distribute food supplies worldwide. Finally, let's consider our current challenges with COVID-19. That is, of course, why we're meeting virtually tonight. It is a Christian belief that all human life has value and should be cared for and preserved as best we can. Between 1918 and 1919, the H1n1 virus, commonly referred to as the Spanish flu, infected 1/3 of the world's population, and it is estimated that 1/10 of the world's population of that time died from this disease. There was no cure and no vaccine at this time. Somewhat of a sobering thought, I think, in our current times. But now, of course, we are in the midst of another worldwide pandemic, and we have made amazing strides in our scientific understanding of how the body works and how diseases can be cured or prevented. It is our scientific discoveries in biology, epidemiology, and medicine which allow us, or will allow us, hopefully, to create a vaccine which will mitigate the cost to humanity of the COVID-19 virus.
So we have this elephant in the room, and I would say it's not helpful for people of faith to be science deniers, and I think it's not helpful for scientists to marginalize people of faith. And unfortunately, this happens a lot, I would say primarily in the country south of us, but it can happen elsewhere. I think we need to appreciate that science and faith are asking different questions, but not totally disconnected. There is overlap between the questions. And understanding that overlap, getting around it, I think would help us deal with the elephant in the room. You know, it'd be fun to have one of those as a pet.
Go for it. Okay. So one other question that's often discussed in these types of forums is, how do Christians view the authority of the Bible? When we attest to the Bible as being inerrant or without error, scholars outside of the faith are quick to point out factual contradictions or historical inaccuracies in the Bible. Personally, I prefer to describe the Bible as a guide to our Christian faith and life. I do not tend to think of it as an authority on matters of science or history. This is sometimes referred to as a liberal or progressive view, and I respect that there would be differing opinions about that. As Christians, we also regard the traditions of the church, our own spiritual experiences, and our ability to think things through for ourselves as pathways which inform our journeys to follow Jesus in faith and life. These four things, the Bible, church tradition, experience, and reason, are often referred to as the Wesleyan pillars. Some of you may be familiar with that construct. I think this understanding of the Bible as a guide to the spiritual life of the Christian is the most helpful perspective. One can study the Bible, of course, from an academic, theological, historical, or literary perspective. And many academics, both Christian and non-Christian, have done so over many centuries. And much of my training as a pastor included theological study about the history of the church and the tradition, the theological positions of my own denomination. But also as Christians, we want to study the Bible as a guide for the development of our own Christian character. Is our study of the Bible helping us to become more faithful followers of Jesus Christ? Is our study of the Bible developing in us what the Bible defines as the fruits of the Spirit? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. We read this in Galatians 5, verse 22 and 23.
All right, Nancy and Rob, thank you so much for sharing. It was really great just getting your perspective on how faith and science are, in a sense, asking different questions, and there are different ways, different perspectives to approach the two, but that doesn't mean they're exclusive. So it was just wonderful to hear that. I really enjoyed listening to the different examples that you provided and really how you supported and highlighted that perspective. Thank you so much. So now on to our next question. Really at the practical level, can faith and science coexist? Rob, what's it like being married to a pastor? And Nancy, what is it like being married to a scientist? What is that like in your everyday life?
Well, here it goes. This is the tough part. Well, we had professional challenges that come with all two-career families, and we're not any different from other two-career families in that regard. We had to decide how we would organize our home life so that each of us could pursue our vocational objectives. We had to figure out how to organize household chores, allocating them, how to deal with childcare when our daughter was young. To turn to my particular career, academic careers require high commitment, intense focus, and that can make a person very singular-minded at times, and often it can, if you let it, just become your entire universe and mental framework. This is where I feel being part of a church, a Christian community, has been very helpful. I like to think it has helped me keep some balance in my life, to remember that the universe is not just about physics, it's not just about scientists. It's about God's calling and about the community of faith.
I think that a strength of our marriage is that we have always supported one another in our careers. Sometimes two-career couples speak about taking a my turn and your turn approach, and perhaps that would describe our marriage and our vocational choices.
So yeah, Nancy actually did step away from her career activities to accompany me on 3 international sabbatical leaves to various parts of the world. And this was somewhat disruptive to her personal career advancement, but I think as we look back, we would say it was a great benefit in our family life as well, of course, for my career.
And I would definitely agree with that. Although at the time it was pretty challenging to pack up the family and move every few years. Alternatively, Rob supported me when I left a permanent position in counseling services at the University of Waterloo to return to school and prepare for my transition into pastoral ministry. And career transitions in midlife such as this can be disruptive to family life. I'm very grateful that Rob chose to support me in this. We've always supported each other in pursuing our career goals outside the family by making accommodations within the family. We believe our lives are richer for this, and likely we have both learned to be more Christ-like in the sacrifices we've been called to make for each other.
There were personal challenges. I was a terrible pastor spouse. I didn't cook, I didn't sew, I didn't knit. It was just, I'm being a bit facetious. People don't quite know what to do if the pastor spouse is male. But turning back to being a scientist, I tend to see things somewhat more in black and white terms. I tend to look for the right answer, the right solution to a problem. It's the scientific instinct. And there's a chicken and egg question. Am I like that because I'm a scientist, or am I a scientist because I'm like that? I think it's actually a bit of both. But I'm generally looking for a simplifying principle or rule that can be as broadly applied as possible to all situations.
Now, I tend to think of things more in terms of relationships. What will help build our relationship? How will we relate to one another in our family, both our nuclear family and our extended families? What will enable us to have meaningful friendships with other people? When considering our personal relationships, there are not so many clear rules as there are nuances and compromises and accommodations.
So what's it like being married to a pastor? Well, I guess I think I tend to bring a scientific perspective on matters of relationships and faith, and sometimes I feel that is not always appreciated. But I will also admit sometimes it is not always constructive. I would say that when Nancy became a pastor, it gave me an even better appreciation for the broader dimensions of life. What's really involved in pastoring a flock, in walking with people in their deepest moments of sorrow, their finest moments of joy, of how God can be at work within people and in the world.
And for myself, what's it like to be married to a scientist? Well, I think it has been good for me to understand that Rob often approaches many things in life from a scientific viewpoint. Learning more about how he experiences and understands the world around him has helped me to be a more supportive and compassionate partner. But I will also say that there's probably been a journey there, and probably earlier times where I would just shake my head about some things that I just said, well, no, I just don't see the world that way.
Anyway, I think I'd say our marriage is enhanced because we have learned to be curious about one another, to continually seek to understand one another and our worldviews better. At our best moments, we've been able to recognize strengths in the other, and that are greater than what we alone have to offer, that together the relationship is greater than the sum of the parts.
I would say we have learned to be patient with one another when our views on various matters don't entirely align. It is actually a good thing to sometimes be in conversation with someone you don't entirely agree with. It can help you to sharpen your own thinking and the way that you express your views. And sometimes you will even change your mind.
That's good. You should.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. And one thing that I just gathered as you were chatting was just that element of unity in diversity, that even in, your different views, sometimes your different perspectives, that there's a unity and a sense of working together. So that's fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. So the final question we have for you tonight is, do you see any parallels between science and faith and your own marriage? And is science and faith like a marriage, or are there better metaphors?
Well, is it like a marriage? I'd say yes and no. Science and faith are two different worldviews, and they're not fully congruent, but they're also not fully dissonant or divergent. They overlap, as we discussed earlier. Marriage, I think, is a bit like that, somewhat like that. A marriage is a joining together of two people that are different, that they're neither fully compatible nor hopefully fully incompatible, though I suppose when people get divorced, they think they are. They need to learn to work together to make the whole greater than the sum of the parts. As individuals, we do have our own individual personalities, thoughts, ideas, and preferences. So I would say that there is some similarity.
Well, the first thing I will say is I thought this was a very strange question. However, I have to admit that we use images and metaphors all the time to describe our spirituality and our spiritual experiences. So I suppose I can't protest too much.
Another metaphor I like is one that John Polkinghorne has put forward. He was a particle physicist who, at the age of 50, went into the Anglican ministry, and he's been very influential in the field. He proposed that science and Christian faith are like cousins and resemble each other that way. They look alike. Cousins do look alike, but not as much as siblings. And so they have their own different ways of appearing and dealing with the world, but there is nevertheless a rooted relationship. And I also think that is a good metaphor.
So sometimes people feel that science is about what can be proved, and faith is about things that must be taken on blind faith. But here's an interesting thing. Science proceeds on faith as well. It's the faith that nature can be understood. The best example that I know of has to do with quantum physics and gravity, something I've heard quite a few lectures about in my time. As I understand it, we have a theory of quantum physics that beautifully describes molecules and atoms and has applications everywhere, from computers to communication. We also have a theory of gravity, general relativity, that describes time and space as being curved, and that was confirmed with the discovery of gravitational waves and is needed to make our GPS systems work.
Oh, preach it, sister.
And who doesn't use one of those now? Everybody. But when scientists combine these two theories, gravity and the quantum theory, they get mathematical contradictions. Together, they don't make sense. They don't fit together. So then do we give up on science? No. We have faith that nature can be understood, and that keeps scientists going, keeping them working on discovering new things, wrestling with the contradictions until they get to something that fits better.
And I've also learned that social relationships and organizational structures, although they can be complex, people can learn guidelines, strategies, or algorithms, if you like that term, that help them navigate and build stronger relationships. In the Mennonite Church, for example, the peace theology runs very deep, but they also run workshops on how to be peacemakers, how to bring peace to a situation, to really, in practical terms, live out that teaching of Jesus. We need and value relationships in our lives, not only in our personal and family spheres, but also in our professional work. We can always improve our ability to relate to others in positive and in constructive ways. So what do we say in conclusion? Sometimes it is not easy being married.
And sometimes it is not easy putting together science and faith.
But in both cases, the effort can be very rewarding.
Thank you for inviting us to share with you this evening.
Thanks for the discussion.
Thank you so much, Robert and Nancy. It was lovely learning from you this evening. It's been so interesting to just learn from your perspectives and just from your wisdom. So thank you so much for sharing and engaging us this evening. And with that, we'll transition to the question and answer segment. So first, we have a question that was emailed in before our event. I'll read that first. And then after that, I see we also have some questions here in the Q&A box. All right, so the first question for this evening is, what advice would you give to a master's or PhD candidate, and also to those who are mentoring and supporting them, who are in fields where the only accepted orthodoxy is a complete materialistic naturalism, that only those pieces support the a priori conclusion that there is no supernatural, i.e. no God, and are acceptable, especially with respect to the pressure to acquiesce in order to have your supervisor support your research, to have your thesis accepted, or to publish only within the accepted naturalist orthodoxy, if you ever hope to gain a tenure-track position? Would you like me to reread that question, or did you capture it okay?
No, I think I've got it. Yeah, that's a difficult one, especially if you are a student, which I take the questioner to be. I would say first, scientific orthodoxy is there for a reason. And one may disagree with it, but the scientific picture has been built up through a very long and intricate chain of reasoning. As the quantum gravity example pointed out, we haven't finished yet. There are still fundamental conflicts at the core. What I would suggest, first of all, is within your own field, try and understand why the orthodoxy is what it is. Learn the reasons for it. Too often people criticize without understanding the rationale. This can happen even within science, where people say, oh, I think that calculation is stupid, or those people are wrong, and they haven't understood why. Now, you're free to disagree with it. Science would not make any progress unless we challenged the orthodox view. I think the question here then becomes, to what extent is this a large-scale meta-view? Now, I would say, fortunately in physics, I actually find that the more intelligible the universe is, the more it points to God, not the less. We are understanding the depth of the mind behind creation, and that's a teeny tiny part of who God actually is. So at this point, I guess the next thing I would suggest is, when you feel you've understood it enough, and this will be an ongoing exercise, you can begin to dialogue with people and see what it is that you think. Do you buy into this fully naturalistic worldview? Why? One of the big challenges I think that view has, and I think it's in denial of, is it's very nihilistic. It really, the strong atheistic viewpoint, I think, does end in nihilism. But people can't live like that. We're not built to be nihilistic. And I would ask people that have that view why they hold it, and what it is that they would cherish, what it is that they would value above all other. And it's difficult to get people to trust you. Now, when it's your supervisor, there are human rights issues. They don't have the right to tell you what religion you have to follow. I think it has to be nuanced. And here it would get down to what the specific discipline is. I don't know how to speak to it more than that. But whoever asked the question, if you want to contact me by email, I'd be happy to dialogue with you about the specifics, if that would be okay.
Right. Thank you very much for addressing that question. And I'll be sure to forward your contact detail to them so you can dialogue further. And just as a follow-up to that specific question, and also highlighting something you mentioned in your talk earlier, this was focused more from a student perspective, but let's say someone like yourself who's a faculty member and who may be in a context or a position where perhaps, you know, your faith may contradict, not so much contradict, but people may view it, rather your co-workers may view it in contradiction with your work. How do you navigate that? How do you navigate those waters?
Well, often it doesn't come up. On occasion it does. And I do have discussions and debates with people. Not often, but from time to time I have. I think, as it says in Peter, we need to be able and ready to defend the faith that is within us. The hardest thing for an academic to do, most academics, is to listen. And I guess I have to count myself in that category to some extent. It's easier to talk than it is to listen. And I think if we could adopt a more listening posture as to why people think what they think, why they might be hostile to faith, we will get farther. The other awkward thing, turning the tables, is I supervise a number of grad students. I teach a lot of undergrads. And I need to tread a careful line. It's not my job to proselytize them or to force my faith down their throat. But by the same token, I'm not going to pretend I'm not a Christian. And so usually I think people figure it out, and now and then students ask me, undergrads approach me after class, and we have a discussion. And I try to be open to that. But Christian faith is not coercive. The love of God is inviting. It's not something that you can't be forced into it. You have to choose it of your own volition and let the Spirit find you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for addressing that question. Now looking at some of the questions we have in the Q&A. The first one is, in terms of major epistemological theories, foundationalism, currentism, etc., what would you say is the epistemology of most scientists?
You want to take that?
Uh-huh.
Well, it's usually called methodological naturalism. You adopt a neutrality about nature that at its best says all we are interested in is describing nature. The meaning of the description then goes beyond science. So I would say that's the dominant epistemology. You can often get into very deep questions in physics. What is the meaning of time? What is the meaning of the beginning of the universe? And it's not out of bounds theologically to have discussions about these issues. I would say they mentioned foundationalism, coherentism. I think there are several different views about what the meta-philosophy is of science, but I think the one that's closest to the way science is practiced is the view by Lakatosh. We have a research program where we have core beliefs that are almost impossible to falsify, and then peripheral beliefs and more peripheral ones. And the farther you are from the core, the easier it is to test. To be specific, conservation of energy is foundational to physics. And it's very glib to say, oh, well, if we had experiments, we could prove energy isn't conserved. I personally think that is exceptionally unlikely. Every time we find in an experiment that energy is not conserved, we don't give up and say, oh, guess that was wrong. Instead, we find that energy has changed its form. This is how new particles are discovered in particle physics experiments. The experimentalists look for missing energy, and that tells them, there's a new subatomic particle. There's also the issue of where our authority lies, and I think maybe Nancy could speak to that.
Sorry.
No, she wants to speak to the next. Maybe we'll stop there. Why don't you go to the next one? Why don't we go to the next one?
All right. Thank you for addressing that question, Rob. So the next question here is, how can a non-scientist, member of the public, get to the bottom of publicly disputed scientific issues such as climate science or a proper response to COVID?
I saw that question come up, and I read it a few times to see if I could get the gist of it. And my understanding is that the person is asking, well, if I'm not a scientist, then who can I believe when they talk about scientific issues such as the proper response to COVID or the need to adapt our economies to modify current trends in climate change? That's how I understood the question. And I think it's an excellent question. And I think as ordinary members of the public, we are always asking, where are our authorities? Who are we regarding as our authorities? Whose opinions are we considering? Perhaps a number of us remember in the early days of the COVID-19 shutdown in March 11th, and everything in our economy was shutting down. And we were on the news nonstop. Like, we were trying to figure out what's going on and who knows something and what can they tell us? And I think it's a really good question. I think that most of us probably have a sense of where our established authorities are in various domains. I think right now, most of us in Canada, we're looking for at the medical establishment. We're listening to the chief medical officer in Canada, in Ontario, sort of giving us guidelines, because we can't claim to know better than they do. And I think for climate change, I mean, we read a variety of things and we try to discern for ourselves what can we have confidence in. And the more the scientific community converges in a particular direction, then probably that's where we non-specialists tend to converge as well.
Thank you so much for addressing that question, Nancy. So the next question here is from Edmund Lee. He said, "Hi, Rob and Nancy. Thank you for presenting this evening. The material is very interesting and thought-provoking. Thank you for your comment, Edmund." And his question is whether or not there is a major disconnect between what the Bible teaches in Genesis regarding the creation of the world, as opposed to current geological records pertaining particularly to the timeline of creation of the earth and the universe in general.
Okay. You want to go ahead?
I'll start, and then you can add in. Sorry. I think it's a very good question, and I think that sometimes the Christian community has gotten a bit lost in the pursuit of a strong clarity around that answer. That's my opinion. Personally, I think that the creation sections in the book of Genesis contain a lot of truth, but I don't particularly think it's geological science truth. I think it's truth about who we are as human beings, our relationships with each other, our relationships with God, our challenges to understand the world around us, the tree of knowledge, and what we do with the knowledge we have. I think they are theological questions. And there are others who have done some work on Christian theology and creation, which basically outline the theological idea that we still name God as the creator, but we don't necessarily feel that Genesis is a description of the creative process in which God engaged. You want to add to that?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, we need to remember science is about the ages of rocks, but faith is about the rock of ages. And we shouldn't get the two confused. My own view is, yeah, there is a major disconnect between what some people say the Bible teaches in Genesis regarding creation and what the geological records are. That's not the same thing as what the Bible says. What I think Genesis is about the real world, about God creating the real world, and I regard it as an attempt for God to speak to the writer of Genesis that this world came from somewhere, and it has particular features that are there by God's intentionality. There's a parallel structure in Genesis, the creation of light, the creation of, oh boy, I remember, light in the first verse, and then the lights of heaven on day 4, the waters and the sky on day 2, and the fish and the birds on day 5, and then land on day 3, and animals and people on day 6, things that are on land. Now, seen that way, that is a scientific understanding. It's a very simplistic one, but what else would you expect of the people that would have heard it and understand it at the time? So I think in that sense, Genesis can be understood scientifically. I think where things go wrong is when we expect a 21st century understanding of science by people that lived thousands of years before science as we know it was there. I'd add one fact to it. The Bible does teach that the universe was created right from Genesis, and in other places, like the book of Job, there's a creation story in the last 4 chapters. And we have a Big Bang. I personally believe that is of considerable theological significance, that the universe does actually have a physical beginning. Scientific investigation could have shown otherwise. And in fact, the prejudice 100 years ago was that it was otherwise, that the universe was eternal. We have discovered it is not eternal. And even if some model comes along describing the beginning of time or something earlier, something very special happened 13.7 billion years ago that is points, I would say, very much toward a creator.
Thank you so much for addressing that question. So the next question we have here is, how do you feel different denominations have influenced your and perhaps other people's perspective on science, and are some more compatible than others?
That is such an interesting question. What that made me think about is back to Rob's brief reflection on the period of time when Newton and Galileo were making all of their scientific discoveries. And at that time, the church and the theological position of the church and the Christian faith in Western Europe were considered paramount. Theology was called the queen of the sciences, and you couldn't have any kind of position, even a discovered scientific truth, that contradicted anything in the church's teaching or in the biblical record. And so that's where you got a number of these controversies that are, some of them, such as Galileo, are well known. I think our modern thinking is much different, and we just alluded to that in the last question. We understand that science has a trajectory. We understand there are many things we can learn about the world, and then we try to put that together with our beliefs about spirituality and personal well-being and mental health and who God is and who we are in relationship to each other. I don't really think I'm knowledgeable enough to identify whether some denominations would be more open. I guess if I were to be bold off the top of my head, I would say I think the mainline Protestant denominations would be quite open, and can't speak for the Catholic Church. Probably more conservative, fundamental reflections of the Christian faith would be less open to what I just described.
Well, I don't have to. If it comes up later, I could say more, but why don't we go to the next one?
All right. Thank you for addressing that question. The next question here from Grant Cheng. He says, thanks for doing this. Thank you for your comment, Grant. What would each of you say to someone who has favored or abandoned science for faith or faith for science?
Well, it's hard for me to argue with the first one. I guess it would depend on what abandoning faith for science for faith meant. There are people that give up a scientific career to go into the ministry. John Polkinghorne was one of them. He stopped at the age of 50 and went into the ministry and had a very fruitful second career in that regard. Some people do feel the call of God and were in the sciences. There are people in the CSCA that are in that category. I guess it's a matter of whether you change or abandon it. I don't think scientific thinking should be abandoned. I think it's a very useful way of thinking about the world. And I think it is a manner of thinking that would both liberal, mainline, and conservative Protestant denominations would do well to adopt. Each of them, I think, tends to distort this in their own ways. Abandoning faith for science. Well, yeah, that's a tougher one. I think I've said this a number of times over the years. I think churches of all stripes need to do more to, if I dare use the word, nurture people that think scientifically. And often they really don't know what to do with such people. The kids that ask the awkward questions about Noah's Ark or about the resurrection, or the kids that are more interested in the operation of things. There are selection effects where people that tend to go into Christian ministry aren't interested in scientific questions. It's understandable. If they were interested, they'd probably become scientists. But one of the problems I think we have with that, an occupational hazard, is how do you minister to people that do think like scientists? And they are a significant fraction of the young people that are within churches. And I think churches need to speak better to those people, to understand them as scientists in terms of their nascent and developing scientific thinking. And some churches do try to do a good job. Part of the job of the CSCA is to address that concern. but I still think there's a lot that could be done. What I would say to someone that has done it, as I say, I just don't understand the nihilism of the non-theistic viewpoint. The life of Christ, his death on the cross, the resurrection, the teachings of the faith speak very deeply to me. One needs to be open to that. I have not abandoned my position as a scientist while accepting that. I do find it hurts a bit to see that other people have. Yeah.
Thank you for addressing that question, Rob. So the next question we have here is, how can contemporary religion, Christianity, and in brackets Catholicism, Protestants, etc., or otherwise, stand the test on reason and rationality in the world of technology and fundamental sciences, currently in an obscure realm of difficulty in their testability?
Well, I'll start with that. I think that we maybe misunderstand that that faith is going to be entirely provable or will entirely stand the test of reason or rationality. I tried to speak to some of the sort of spiritual longings that we experience when we ask questions about our own lives, the purpose of our lives, the nature of our relationships. These are things that can't be proved, but they're part of our human experience. And maybe our spirituality is really designed more to speak to our inner world, our inner reflections, and the way we relate to others, and the way we understand ourselves in the world. That's not to say that it isn't at all rational, but I do think there will definitely be people for whom it will not be sufficiently rational, and they will choose not to be people of faith. And I think we accept that.
Yeah, I think there are limits to rationality. Ultimately, rationality is non-motivational. It's our emotions, it's our non-rational side from where we derive the reason to do things. I became a scientist because I was curious, but curiosity in and of itself isn't rational. It's just as rational to not be curious as it is to be curious. Why am I curious? Where does curiosity come from? And I would say when we're asking questions like that, we're not only asking theological questions or psychological questions, we're also asking theological questions. And that's partly why it's one of the reasons why I said earlier that I think science is in part a quest for faith, properly understood, a quest of faith, rather. It's part of working out one's own salvation for those that are in that kind of discipline.
Right, thank you very much for addressing that question. So the next question comes from Ruth Hansberger. She asks, Dr. Mann, you briefly mentioned that science supports a directness to the universe, and that this particularly comes from cosmology. Can you go into more detail on what you mean by this and what scientific evidence there is for this?
Well, that's about a 1-hour talk, so I'll try to be brief. But basically, about a little more than 100 years ago, 110 years ago, certainly, the prejudice was the universe had been here for eternity. The stars seemed to move in random patterns like a gas that just was here forever and ever. What was discovered in the 20th century is this picture is wrong, that the universe actually is not static and eternal. It is expanding. It's getting bigger every day, literally by having more empty space between galaxies today than there was yesterday. If you imagine, the easiest way to imagine this is to think of a balloon, and if you paint white dots on the surface of a balloon, as if you inflated the balloon, every white dot would think all the other white dots were moving away from it. But what is happening is the space on the surface of the balloon is getting bigger and bigger as the balloon inflates. We have discovered that our universe actually is like that. So going backwards, You can ask, well, when was the balloon just a single point? And the answer was, that comes out as 13.7 billion years ago. And we now know that number to within 1%. If you then run the clock forward from there, there is a developmental history of the universe being, as they say in the Big Bang Show, our whole universe was in a hot, dense state, and 14 billion years ago, expansion started. And the plasma begins to cool into atoms that then form stars and planets and galaxies. And there's an entire developmental history that we have not fully worked out. Now, the universe didn't have to have a history, but it does. It's going somewhere. And that to me speaks to a creator that has a mind for directedness. But there is a problem with that, is that the best of our scientific knowledge says the universe isn't going to have a happy ending. And as far as we know, it's going to expand faster and faster into some state of ultimate dark dilutedness. What does one do with that? Well, in my view, we either give in to nihilism or we place our hope in God. That God is not creating a directed universe for nothing. He has not created people that yearn for purpose and meaning for nothing. My faith says that's there for a reason. That's pointing to a capital G personal God.
Thank you for addressing that question. So the final question we have in the chat here is, how do you manage failure as a scientist? In any science or engineering role, there's typically understanding that your efforts get you the results, especially when it comes to your output. But by faith, you understand that life doesn't always go your way, and our success depends also on grace. How do you process your failures with these two lenses and not beat yourself up?
Well, it helps if you never fail. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not supposed to say that, am I? No, really, you do. You fail. And it is difficult. This is part of why I put in the humility versus mastery thing. I think the culture of academia, and I think very much in the sciences, is one of intellectual success. Now, it does have this self-corrective element that means you're going to make mistakes. The difficult thing for young scientists is, as they come into the discipline, they're smart people. These are the people that got A+ in high school, did very well. And then they're in an environment where everybody is as smart as they are. Now, there's a psychological effect that, geez, if I fail, everybody will think I'm an idiot. It's very difficult to overcome that. It does take a certain amount of courage. For me, it was the community of faith, realizing there are people that have other goals, that worship a higher power, that value people as being created in the image of God, and that did help. But yeah, it's no fun to fail. It does hurt, and that has happened to me. It happens to pretty much all scientists. You're right, life doesn't always go your way. And part of learning to be alive is to accept that. In science, I do a lot of research. I have about a dozen grad students. We're working on projects, and yeah, we bash into walls. We do things, the calculation is wrong, or we think something and then we think, oh, I did something really stupid. It takes time to develop a persona that has the confidence to go ahead and make mistakes, but also the humility to admit when you have made a mistake. And I think that is a life skill that I think Christian faith communities do at their best, nurture in people. This can go beyond science, of course, to many other professions. Do you want to speak to this a bit?
Yeah, I'll just speak briefly. I think that one of the pieces of our core Christian theology is that as human beings, we are beloved of God. And I think we are, in our Christian language, we often use the word, we are children of God. That our core identity is not in our professions, it's not in our relationships Our core identity is that we are human beings created in God's image and beloved by God. And I think that there's certainly been many times in my own life when things have not gone the way I had hoped, or things I tried to achieve, I was not successful in, and I did have to recenter myself in my core identity as a person beloved of God, regardless of what I achieved or accomplished or succeeded in or whatever.
Thank you so much for both sharing your views on that question. And personally, I connected with this question. I recently finished my PhD, and a lot of that process was failed experiment after failed experiment and learning to get up and say, okay, let's go back to the drawing board, let's think again. So whoever it is wrote this, hang in there, you can do this, and you will make it. So just a quick question, one final question I have for you, Nancy and Robert, and you could consider it a follow-up question to something that was asked earlier. What would you say if, let's say, an undergraduate student or a graduate student were to come to you wondering how they can learn more about this science and faith dialogue? Any books you would recommend, any resources online or otherwise that you would like to point them to?
Well, I found John Polkinghorne's books, Reason and Reality. There's one, Confessions of a Bottom-Up Thinker, where he goes through the Apostles' Creed and discusses how, as a scientist and as an Anglican minister, he can understand it. Polkinghorne's books are a bit of thick reading, but I find them very worthwhile. There are other, if you want at academic level, there are other very good writers, Arthur Peacock, Ian Barber, Donald Mackay. What I would recommend, I guess this is a bit of advertising for the CSCA, is this is a fellowship of people that are in the sciences, but are Christians by confession, by confession of faith in Christ. And I would encourage you to participate in the organization and belong. Right now, we're confined to online meetings such as this. I joined a long time ago when I was in my 20s, and I found it I found it very worthwhile to fellowship with other believers that have scientific inclinations. There are, if you're a student, there are clubs on campus, InterVarsity, Power to Change, various clubs, Christian clubs that I think could also help nurture one's faith. If you're at a university and you know a Christian professor, feel free to talk to them and ask.
All right, thank you so much for addressing that question. And in concluding, Nancy and Rob, I would like to thank you so much for your time this evening. I know you both have great demands on your schedule, so it meant a lot for you to give an hour and a half to come here and to talk to us, to share your wisdom and your experiences. And I think we're all walking away definitely more enriched than when we first logged on. So thank you so much for your time and for your input. Additionally, I would also like to thank Mark McEwen, who is the host of this Zoom call, and he has been behind all the advertising for this event and for any event you see online. That's Mark. So Mark, all your efforts are greatly appreciated. Thank you very much for everything you do and continue to do for the CSCA. And with that, I'd like to thank you, our attendees, for taking time out of your evening to chat with us this evening and to be part of our dialogue. We hope that you've learned a lot and that it's been enriching for you. And just have a few announcements to make before we proceed, but really before those announcements, just really like to clap hands for you, Nancy and Robin, say thank you last time.
It's our pleasure. Thank you very much, Nyasha.
Thank you. So one thing I'd like to announce is that we have an event coming up, the final one for the year, on December 1st, where Dr. Patrick Franklin, who's actually the national leader of the CSDA, will be giving a talk alongside his fantastic wife, Mrs. Elena Franklin. They'll be talking about suffering and how to engage in the Christian faith during that, and really sharing a personal story of theirs. And in January, we have a national conference that will really bring together people in the CSEAs all over Canada and our sister organization, the ASA. So it will be a North America event. I would like to invite you all to that. And one thing that we do have lined up for March is a talk on God and the Big Bang by Dr. Arnold Sakema, who is based in Vancouver, but obviously it will be a virtual event. So thank you all for logging on this evening. Such a pleasure engaging with you on this platform, and I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Thank you.